Jessica!
Where's Jessica?
Hi,
I don't see
Jessie.
her.
Hi, everyone.
Boo!
You look so
Hello.
beautiful.
Thank you. This is like my academic quinceañera, so I had to try.
Vamos a bailar el vals.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, let's get started. Okay, our time is precious and limited, so it's really wonderful to see all of you. I see many beautiful, familiar faces. So it's wonderful during this time of social distancing. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our Zoominar this afternoon. Our bodies are art, racialized sexuality, class, and the power of aesthetic excess. Okay, so this is a roundtable, a celebration of JILLIAN Hernandez's spanking new book from Duke University Press, Aesthetics of Excess, the Art and Politics, okay, wonderful. The Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment, okay? My name is Hoang Nguyen, and I teach at UC San Diego in the Department of Literature, where I teach film, media, and cultural studies. Okay, so I would like to introduce our fantastic speakers for this afternoon. Okay, our first speaker is Darius Bost. He is Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Utah and co-editor of Frontiers, a journal of women's studies. His research focuses in the areas of Black cultural studies, feminist gender and sexuality studies, and medical humanities. Professor Bost is the author of the award-winning book, Evidence of Being, The Black Gay Cultural Renaissance, and the Politics of Violence, okay, from 2019. His current book project is an interdisciplinary study of queer visual cultures across the Anglophone Black diaspora from the 1970s to the present. Okay. Our second speaker is Nicole R. Fleetwood. She is Professor of American Studies and Art History at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. She is the author of 3 books. The first is On Racial Icons, Blackness and the Public Imagination from 2015, and Troubling Vision, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, which was the recipient of the 2012 Laura Romero First Book Publication Prize of the American Studies Association. She recently received the College Art Association Frank Jewett Mather Award and the Charles Rufus Moria Book Award for her 3rd book, Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration from 2020. Okay. Our 3rd speaker is Daphne V. Taylor-Garcia, who is an Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego. Professor Taylor-Garcia received her PhD from UC Berkeley in Department of Ethnic Studies, after which she was awarded the President's Postdoctoral Fellowship at UC Santa Barbara. She is the recipient of numerous awards, most recently from the UC Humanities Research Institute at UC Irvine. She is the author of The Existence of the Mixed Race Damné, Decolonialism, Class, Gender, Race from 2018. Okay. Our 4th speaker, this is pretty amazing, is Juana Maria Rodriguez, who is a professor of ethnic studies and core faculty in performance studies at UC Berkeley. Professor Rodriguez is the author of 2 books, Queer Latinidad, Identity Practices, Discursive Spaces from 2003, and Sexual Futures, Queer Gestures, and Other Latina Longings from 2014. Okay. This latter book won the Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize at the MLA and was a Lambda Literary Foundation finalist for LGBT studies. She is currently working on a book on visual culture and Latina sexual labor, and I believe from Facebook, it's called Puta Life. And she is also co-editing a special issue of TSQ on trans studies on Las Americas. Okay. Last but not least, our featured speaker is JILLIAN Hernandez. She studies the autonomous aesthetics and sexualities of Black and Latinx people. Her scholarship crosses the fields of art history, performance, gender, and ethnic studies, and is informed by her work as a community arts educator, curator, and cultural producer. Her book, Aesthetics of Excess, The Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment from 2020, traces how the body practices and art making of Black and Latinx women and girls are intertwined, and how they complicate conventional notions of cultural value and sexual respectability. She is an assistant professor in the Center for Gender, Sexualities, and Women's Studies Research at the University of Florida. Okay, so before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the institutional support for this event by UC San Diego's Department of Literature, the Department of Ethnic Studies, Program in Critical Gender Studies, and the Institute of Arts and Humanities. All right, so our format for the Zoominar will be JILLIAN will introduce the book, share some visuals and some remarks with us, and then that will be followed by commentaries by our esteemed panelists. Darius will talk about body, Nicole will discuss aesthetics, Daphne will discourse on class, and Juana is in charge of erotics. Okay, and then we'll have some remarks by JILLIAN, and then open it up to discussion and Q&A. All right, so I hand it over to JILLIAN.
Thank you so much, Hoang. This means so much. I want to thank you for your work in imagining and organizing this gathering with scholars who really just shape and inspire my thinking. I really do feel like this is like the quinceañera I never had, and it just means so much. I'm grateful to be in community with you all. I know that many of us are grieving and many of us are burned out through the continued demands of the Academy in pandemic. And I want to express my sincere and heartfelt appreciation to the scholars who are joining me on this panel. Thank you so much for the gift of your time. It really means so much to me. And I want to thank everyone attending also for clicking on another Zoom link and spending your precious time with us. So much appreciation there. So I'm going to share some images and just talk a little bit about the origins of the book and a little bit on my approaches, how I sort of arrived at this work and how it sort of takes form in the book. And what you see here is the image from the cover, which is an artwork by the Latina artist Crystal Pearl Molinari, who is one of my muses. And you see her work on Juana's background. And the title of that piece is Just as a Reminder to Myself. And it's a photograph of her with images of, she wore all of her father's chains. It's after he passed away. And the lyric, it's a Drake lyric, but here it takes on added significance with all these chains that belong to her father, which also reminds me of a picture I have of my father from the 80s. So Aesthetics of Excess, the art and politics of Black and Latina embodiment, has several origins. I would say that working with my dad at a jewelry exchange in New York's Chinatown in the 1980s was a moment, as was navigating my body and queer desires as a bisexual teenager under my strict mother's roof, and later embodying the young pregnant Latina traversing the landscape of Miami. These intimate experiences and the ways in which poetry and learning about the work of women of color artists helped me survive them led me to form a project in 2004, Women on the Rise, that used feminist art as a mode for connecting with Black and Latina girls and engaging them in creative practice. I designed Women on the Rise as an intergenerational feminist art praxis rather than a form of art therapy, self-work, or carceral reform. The goal of this praxis was to generate a place for girls of color, both in detention and at other community sites, to engage in self-expression and critical dialogue, practices that they were either socially or institutionally excluded from, being theorists or being artists. So Women on the Rise workshops were performative spaces that culminated in the production of artwork by participants in a range of media that were inspired by and responded to the particular practices of feminist artists. For example, girls created and documented silhouette forms that they created in nature in Miami. When they learned about Ana Mendieta's silhouette pieces of the 1970s, they captured images in their schools and neighborhoods through gilded frames when they learned about Lorraine O'Grady's Artists Project. They fashioned elaborate headdresses for iconic Black women in the project based on Firelei Baez's work. And they composed collages inspired by Yayoi Kusama's obliteration pieces. These workshops were collaboratively led and developed by myself and other women artists in Miami, such as Anya Wallace, Nereida Garcia Ferraz, Guadalupe Figueras, Christopher Molinari, Isabel Moros, Ali Prosh, Dinora de Jesus Rodriguez, Monica Lopez de Victoria, Naomi Fisher, and many others I wish I had the time to name. The relations and praxis of Women on the Rise, situated within Miami's particular formations of gender, class, and race, form the lens through which I view the spectacularly styled bodies of Black and Latinx women and girls. One event that catalyzed my book was the fallout that I was met with after circulating Miami-based Cuban-American artist Cristopero Molinari's photograph, Havana Riviera. The work is a part of a series of photographs titled Then Again, where Molinari recreates photographs of her mother, who was a model and renowned vedette performer in 1960s Cuba, with her own body through images that she captured during visits to Cuba in 2011 and again in 2012. Then Again is a meditation on time, nation, identity, and the gendered pressures of familial expectations as she quite literally measures herself up against her mother's body. In Havana Riviera, Molinari and her mother are situated in the same outdoor poolside area of the iconic Havana Riviera Hotel. Despite the fact that these photographs were taken several decades apart, the manner in which they reveal the passage of time is surprisingly subtle due to Cuba's particular temporality. The only indicators of change are coded by the vintage patio table in the background of her mother's modeling shot and the new tropical landscaping in Molinari's more recent image. The heels and pantyhose that Sonia Perla Heel wears with her bathing suit contrast with her daughter's plastic flip-flops. I selected the image for the promotion of a lecture series that I organized in Miami in 2012 titled Latina Women in the Body because of its multi-layered evocation of history, exile, and diaspora in relation to Latina embodiment that are particular to a Miami context and crafted by a local Latina artist. But I never anticipated the controversy that would arise from circulating it, and especially in a place like Miami where images of women in bathing suits are really a non-thing. So the lecture series was held at MoCA in North Miami at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami with co-sponsorship from the Women's Studies Center at Florida International University, where I had gone for undergrad. At the time, I was working at the art museum, doing the work with Women on the Rise, while also researching for my dissertation. I collaborated with the museum's graphic designer to create the promotional material for the event.
I can't see you, but I am paying attention to this.
Oh, that's good to know. I'm sorry,
so
if
sorry.
someone can mute, that would be awesome. Thank you so much. So several days after the postcard invitation for the lecture series was sent out to the museum's mailing list, I received an urgent message from the museum director alerting me that a major Cuban American donor and supporter of the museum had called to express outrage that such a demeaning image was circulated to thousands of supporters. The donor pulled funding from an upcoming event and threatened further repercussions for the institution if the image was not immediately removed from the museum website. The issues that the donor cited with the image were that it highlighted the women's sexuality and that the word Latina was used in the program title rather than Hispanic. Hispanic being a term they felt more appropriately described themselves and the Latinx community in Miami. The donor suggested that I had a political agenda in selecting the image and framed me as reckless, damaging the quote unquote Hispanic community through the circulation of this image. The Cuban American Museum donor's view was echoed by many followers of MOCA's Facebook page. So this was also posted on the museum's Facebook. And you know, some museum supporters admonished the institution for highlighting Latina ass in the promotional image and thereby reifying harmful stereotypes. This position was also shared by senior administration officials at Florida International University, including a white feminist dean who had formerly directed the Women's Studies Center. She sent me an email stating that the degrading postcard was embarrassing the university through the posters on display around campus, and inquiring why I decided to choose an image that shows a Latina wearing a quote, ill-fitting bathing suit. Additionally, an influential contemporary Latino artist from Miami complained that Molinari and I failed to critique Latina aesthetic excess for its collusion with racist and sexist stereotypes and consumerism. He went as far as to cite my body comportment during one of the lecture panels, saying that I was playing with my hair and all that messy stuff. So I was overwhelmed by the attacks on the image on multiple levels, and particularly how the bodies of both Molinari and myself were brought into their sweep and were framed as signifying a misfit and illegitimate Latinidad. 2 years later, Molinari and I collaborated on a photographic project titled Ill-Fitted, inspired by the girdle and body shaping underwear advertisements targeted to women that are ubiquitous in Miami's working class Latinx neighborhood. So we really played with this idea of like the ill-fitting, right? And we ended up having fun with it. Upon reflecting on the controversy, I found that critics of Havana Riviera were implicitly endorsing what they believed to be a more tasteful image of Latina femininity that drew from a classed ideal of thin, flat-assed feminine embodiment. Rather than through skin color, the curves of Sonia and Crystal's shapely buttocks index a tacit, yet nonetheless intolerable Blackness to critics. And in the book, I go more into depth into how Blackness is operating within these respectability politics, and I look forward to discussing that further. These debates around legibility and respectability led me to study how the discourse of excess significantly structures the boundaries around legitimate and deviant forms of gendered Blackness and Latinidad. These aesthetics are often read as indicating the sexually deviant and unproductive character of Black and Latina women and girls. I find that these responses stem in significant part from the ways that aesthetics of excess make class burn and disrupt colonial circulations of cultural value. Whether intended or not, these visual and bodily practices shun the neoliberal call to erase socioeconomic difference and perform capitalist productivity and gender respectability. Instead, the women and girls of color who embrace the aesthetics of excess work their bodies and their cultural production with an artful luxury that is deemed unfit for poor and working class folks. Aesthetics of excess are regularly subject to denigration in social discourse when incarnated by working class women and girls of color, but they have also produced significant cultural and material capital when appropriated by elite contemporary artists and popular music performers. Aesthetics of excess are visual and corporeal practices that mark Black and Latina bodies through spectacular ornamentality. But it's important for me to stress that there's nothing inherently excessive in the embodiments I discuss in the book, as to attribute excess would be to measure these styles against modernist European stylistic values. Influential Western aesthetic theories linked racial and gendered inferiority to so-called aesthetic indulgence. These discourses have traveled from Europe to the US through the institutionalization of canonical histories of Western art and design, and they find contemporary life in the negative, racializing assessments of Black and Latina women and girls, whose working class embodiments situate them as the antithesis of high style and therefore as sexual others. Rather than attempt to normalize Black and Latina body aesthetics as tasteful or normal, I plumb the discourse of aesthetic excess and the power of aesthetics to probe the social and cultural disturbances they spark, and thus illuminate how class, race, gender, and sexual difference are formed through contemporary visual culture and embodiment. I attend to how Black and Latina women and girls tarry with these formations and make art and pleasure out of them. To exceed is to trespass, and gazes invested in neoliberal racial, class, gender, and sexual normativity perceive excess as a negative, a social liability or deviancy, but I frame the excess engaged in the book as abundance, as possessing more than the essential, the alternative value that Puerto Rican artist Pepón Osorio describes as, quote, the philosophy that more is better. Aesthetics of excess embrace abundance, where the political order would impose austerity upon the racialized poor and working class. To present aesthetic excess is to make oneself hypervisible, but not necessarily in an effort to gain legitimacy or legibility. Embodying such styles often stems from one's racial, ethnic, and gendered culture, and the desire to utilize the body creatively, admire one's self-image, and potentially attract the gazes of others. Aesthetics of excess are the targets of commodification, appropriation, cultural dismissal, and erasure, but they tend to spectacularly survive and morph, slipping through such attempts at capture. It's how we dress in the undercommons. While aesthetics of excess declare respect in the face of white supremacist state surveillance of Black and Latinx consumption, they encompass and perform much more than that. These aesthetics that become targets of scrutiny and attack stem from the diasporic, creative, cultural, and spiritual lineages that predate European colonization, though they have been undeniably altered by it. The book takes up the queering work performed by aesthetic excess and upsetting the dehumanizing formations of race, gender, class, and sexuality that are operative in the 21st century United States. I come to these understandings through Women on the Rise, through which I have learned how notions of high and low culture are complicated when young women of color engage in cultural production, as well as how they challenge the disciplining of their bodies and sexualities through artistic authorship. Thus, the book draws extensively from the insights of the Black and Latina young women I worked with, who I also refer to as artists, Women on the Rise artists. And my exchanges with them are also evoked in the book through visual and textual interludes, in addition to my creative responses. I juxtapose the body practices of self-described gay and heterosexual women on the rise artists in Miami with images produced by contemporary visual and popular culture artists whose work stages sexual bodies, such as Kara Walker, and they're working on a project here inspired by the Sugar Baby, and Nicki Minaj. These are figures who are taught in Women on the Rise workshops or whose work is consumed by project participants. Rather than disaggregating the girls' talk about themselves and their readings of cultural production, I highlight how these narratives are intertwined, illustrating the complex interplay between the sexual, racial, class, and gender discourses circulating in the media and girls' aesthetic interpretations, transformations, negotiations, and incarnations of these meanings. My conversations with participants produce what I call body narratives, stories about the experiences, desires, and memories of embodiment. These narratives appear in the book as extended portions of transcripts that I excerpt in order to convey the tone of these stories to readers and evoke the artist's unique voices and personalities. My discussions with the artist prompted recollections of my own girlhood, which I include in the chapters and interludes as autoethnographic reflections. The webs of storytelling that produce the body narratives were often spun while my participants' hands were busy at work on their projects in Women on the Rise. Therefore, our conversations, the processes of art making, and the images of work by contemporary women artists of color are all tightly woven together. The body narratives are oral, visual, and corporeal at once. They are the products of aesthetic labor and relations between Black and Latina girls and women. Artistic chusmeria. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Darius Bost. I am happy to be here to celebrate Jillian's wonderful book and to be on this panel to share space with these folks that I admire. I want to, I'm trying to, I think I need to share my screen. I'm gonna go ahead and do it now so I don't forget. All right, let's see. No, sorry. Okay, I'll do it this way. All right. There's much to learn from Jillian Hernandez's study of the art and politics of Black and Latina embodiment. To start, she situates her choice of terminology within the history of Miami and the complex modes of racialization that have often pitted Black girls and Latinx girls in opposition to one another. She notes how conquest, nation state formation, and gendered and sexualized forms of racialization have given rise to structural antagonisms, wherein the shadowy figuration of Blackness gives form to Latina embodiment, even as the disciplining of Latina bodies into normative, read as white and respectable, comportment requires the requisite distancing from Blackness. Moreover, the borders of the US nation state have rendered Latinx embodiment as an ethnic formation that becomes intelligible only in terms of its proximity to US racial formations of whiteness and Blackness. These antagonisms govern Hernandez's choice to use the terms Black and Latina rather than the more amorphous formations, women of color or brown. Though she acknowledges that Blackness and Latinidad are in themselves expansive categories, her historical framing of girlhood within the diasporic context of the urban South demonstrates how the racial and class stratification of the city index multiple forms of enclosure that, quote, splice and bend the tethers of race and ethnicity to national linguistic and bodily markers, end quote. This historical framing sets the backdrop for her work with the young artists at Women on the Rise, a feminist community art project she founded at the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami in 2004, in response to increasing numbers of girls committed to Florida's juvenile justice system in the 2000s. Hernandez uses her own life experiences alongside interviews, focus groups, and participant observation drawn from her work at Women on the Rise to demonstrate how Black and Latinx identity formation often requires othering across relations of difference, primarily through violent appraisals of the body. As she notes, quote, Black and Latina are not discrete entities, but volatile formations that in various contexts bleed into, crash, and retract from each other, end quote. At stake for Hernandez is how these volatile formations might be wielded toward coalitional politics across difference. Like Kathy Cohen, Hernandez is interested in the possibilities of collective transformation that emerge when we acknowledge these girls' shared relationship to colonial forms of power that seek to maintain these fictions of discreteness, thereby containing Black and Latinx girls' bodies within normative aesthetic and political economies. Hernandez outlines these complex and entangled historical scripts because they provide the context for understanding the aesthetics of excess. Joining a chorus of feminists and queer of color theorists who have embraced racialized and gendered performances of bodily excess as intimate acts of social upheaval, beautiful experiments, and tireless imaginings of other ways of being and knowing under conditions of confinement. Hernandez theorizes Black and Latina girls' aesthetic practices of excess as, quote, dangerous practices of freedom. She explores how these young Black and Latinx artists, quote, transform transcolonial prohibitions into the raw material for aesthetic innovation. By theorizing embodiment as a practice of aesthetic innovation, Hernandez asks us to reimagine the racialized body as art and to rethink adornment, self-presentation, and even ostentation as creative practices that refuse the relegation of Black and Latinx girlhood into discrete and oppositional categories of identity. An aesthetics of excess celebrates what spills over the enforced boundaries of racialized gender and includes what shines and glitters, what is erased and redrawn, what is purchased for cheap or secured with the bag, as materials for the aesthetic reimagining of racialized embodiment. Hernandez reassesses so-called low-class or underclass bodily performances as sites of creativity through which girlhood can be colored outside the lines. For Hernandez, excess is the refusal to distance oneself from the shadowy darkness of Blackness or the artifice of whiteness, even as these pleasurable acts of identification entail considerable risk of psychological or bodily harm. Since Black and Latinx girls are often hyper-surveilled and disproportionately pushed out of schools or locked up in detention centers, their ability to engage in creative practices of embodiment are often limited. Thus, the work for us, following the Women on the Rise instructors, is to, quote, provide creative time and space for the girls to do the work of complex self-expression, end quote. Perhaps this is why I was so drawn to the 5th chapter of the book, Encounters with Excess, Girls Creating Art, Theory, and Sexual Bodies. In this chapter, Hernandez details the various Women on the Rise projects at Waves, a residential detention facility for pregnant and mothering girls. In one of these projects, the young artists were introduced to the work of Caribbean American artist Shoshana Weinberger, particularly her silhouettes that evoke the image of Saartjie Baartman, derogatorily named by her promoters as the Hottentot Venus. Baartman's embodiment of excess has vexed representations of Black female sexuality from the colonial era to the present. Hernandez describes Weinberger's silhouettes as masses of flesh tied into shape by thick gold chains, as headless bodies with proliferations of breasts and asses clad in tight metallic bras, their straps binding the bulging skin into one corpus that, if undone, risks collapsing into formlessness. For Hernandez, these images give the Hottentot Venus a, quote, futuristic life as an otherworldly grotesque. And although her body is bounded by history, Weinberger's grotesque reimaginings of Baartman, quote, evoke radical corporeal futures through their perverse hyperboles of beauty and sexuality. Artist and fellow instructor Crystal Pearl Molinari, who had previously worked with Weinberger on installing an exhibition of her work, created headless soft sculpture forms of women's bodies that the girls were able to dress and manipulate with bras, panties, and plastic gold beaded chains, taking their inspiration from the Weinberger images. The girls were free to stuff girdles and butt-lifting underwear with batting to create their own sculpture bodies. This project implicated the young artists in the heteronormative sexual economy, in which women are often socialized to read each other's bodies in order to sort them into hierarchical categories. While this art project elicited a range of responses that included shame around women's erotic embodiment, it also included expressions of empathy, social critique, and corporeal pleasure. These assessments reveal how the privileging of the visual under colonial modernity continues to mark these young artists' bodies, just as it marked Bartman's body in the early 19th century as hardened containers of both racial and sexual differences. But I want to suggest that these creative projects offered the young artists alternative ways of knowing racialized embodiment. Throughout the chapter, Hernandez recounts the joy these girls took in crafting these sculpture bodies, although the authorities at the facility saw these practices as unruly. Mentioning the three-dimensional Weinberger project in particular, Hernandez notes how, quote, the girls seemed to relish using their hands to craft sexual women's bodies by and for themselves, end quote. The emphasis on crafting, touching, and using their hands suggests to me that the haptic is critical to their creative performances of embodiment in ways that exceed the tyranny of the visual. Rizvana Bradley has argued that, quote, touching, folding, fingering, or tracing the texture of an object offer themselves as techniques of knowing in art and performance, end quote. Perhaps it is their collective creation of these three-dimensional sculptures, the feel of the various textures, the malleability of these sculpture bodies that attune them to the possibilities of freedom that come with embodying aesthetic excess. Through these beautiful experiments, Hernandez and these young artists teach us that creativity and the imagination are integral to building radical corporeal futures. Because the Black and Latinx girls who populate Hernandez's study often live under conditions of carceral confinement that limit the time and space they have for creativity, embodied or otherwise, we must take seriously their practices of aesthetic innovation as methods for creating otherworldly embodiments unbound by transcolonial prohibitions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you to Darius for those wonderful remarks. So our next speaker is Nicole Fleetwood.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm really happy to be here. And Darius, thank you so much for that. Jillian, I'm so happy and honored to be here to celebrate your incredible book, Aesthetics of Excess, the Art and Politics of Black and Latina Embodiment. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, order it now and set aside time to revel in the complexity, the beauty, and the rigor of this work. It is, I've known of the work that Jillian's been doing for about 7 years now, but I still was not prepared for all of the twists and turns and interventions that are happening in this incredible book. And I should say I came to know about Jillian's work. First of all, she was a PhD student at Rutgers, but through our shared commitment to art as an abolitionist tool, and in particular, learning about her founding Women on the Rise, a collective that she's talked about and that Darius has talked about, bringing together non-incarcerated artists and detained subjects assigned by the state to the category of juvenile, woman, girl in Miami-Dade, South Florida region. And in 2014, Jillian and some members of Women on the Rise participated in a conference and exhibition at Rutgers. And currently, Jillian and Women on the Rise are collaborators in the Marking Time exhibition at MoMA PS1, along with 40 other artists and collectives, and it's on view through April 4th, 2021. And so that is like how Jillian and I came to, I think, know each other intellectually, aesthetically, and through an ethic of love and care. I deeply admire her. And what I want to say is that I was struck most by how this book is so many things, and it does so many things very well. For one, to me, I read it as a love letter to all the things that Jillian loves. It is so beautiful and so powerful. And even, small descriptions like her grandmother adorning herself to go work in a factory in northern New Jersey. There's all these moments where she pauses to honor every person and all the experiences that bring her to this very moment where we're celebrating her and she's having her coming out party. So thank you for that love letter. And I also read it as just like this really powerful journey through method, the personal, you being read as a Bratz doll, as a type of method, you having to kind of go home and think through that, right? And think through your own gender presentation and your resistance or your resistance to certain kind of categorizations, the scholarly, the political, the aesthetic, and for me as someone who I'm kind of a nerd about method. And so I just loved it. And I loved how you brought together so many different discourses as well as your own personal narrative. I also saw it as this incredible mirror for reflecting and refracting Black and Latina femmes, teens, and other presenting bodies and subjecthood who can thrive in the space that you're cultivating in these pages. It's such a well-timed, powerfully articulated intervention into so many fields, and I truly mean this, into gender and sexuality studies, critical race and ethnic studies, contemporary art and visual culture, performance theory, ethnography and everyday life studies, and carceral and abolition studies, which is very much how I was approaching it. And I was so compelled by how your framing of, and I'm speaking to you, Jillian, of your subjects of knowing, your subjects of knowledge, the people you choose to listen to as your theorists, reorient how we understand feminist art history. So I was actually very, I've seen a lot of collaborative art projects take place in prison, as you know that through my own research. And I was really struck by how the way you positioned this work and then shared it back with us changed my way of seeing feminist art history, feminist aesthetic practice, and collaboration, what collaboration can look like in its potentials. I love how capacious aesthetics of excess is, and one that it embraces abundance. And it's an abundance that refuses what you say is the kind of politics of austerity, especially as enforced upon racialized poor and working class people. And I approach your theorizing of aesthetics of excess in conversation with my developing carceral aesthetics for marking time. And in the book, Marking Time, I talk about carceral aesthetics as the production of art under the condition of unfreedom, or as aesthetic interventions that take place in, through, and against the carceral state. And part of how I flesh it out is thinking about the categories of penal space, time, and matter. And these are all, you don't use, again, of course, you don't use these same concepts, but I think the way that you're engaging with your interlocutors and collaborators, it made me look anew at these categories, because you're focusing on captive subjects who are multiply marginalized within public spaces, domestic settings, educational settings, within critical prison and abolition studies, and who are, some of the most punished people, even once they're in prison and jails. That Black and Latina girls and femmes are usually disciplined at a higher rate than any other populations in prison, that they're more likely to be put in solitary confinement, receive disciplinary tickets, for things such as attitude, right? Like that attitude or gestures.
Right.
So, you present this really powerful account of the sheer viciousness of a system that in every way is structured to destroy the possibility of Black and Latina personhood, and how this system is an aesthetic one that is forces a radical disorientation of sensory experience of those held captive. And I've been struck by how even in some of your presentations you talk about, for example, the sedating and drugging of these captive subjects, and that sedating, and it's one to create disciplined bodies, but it is about a kind of aesthetic disorientation. It's about a stripping away of sensory experiences, and recounting some of the experiences of women on the rise entering these spaces. You describe these penal spaces and their material and emotional social deprivation in ways that really, I think, powerfully opens up like the fields of abolition studies, aesthetics, critical prison studies, to by focusing on these multiply marginalized bodies that get dismissed by a whole host of people, even as we know, even feminist scholars and activists, right? In terms of the type of isolation that they experience, the kind of forced and insidious violent notions of therapy and surveillance onto their bodies and into their psyches that's meant to eviscerate their own experience of inhabiting their own skin. And I think your work really is a revelation in that it uncovers and reveals in these really moving ways their aesthetic experiments and creative interventions that are taking place around self-making within punitive captivity. And I was struck by the same part of the book that Darius cited, especially on page 218. And there's this, I wish you oh my goodness, I don't know if people can see this image. You can't show the page, so show the image on 219, because it is the way that this collaborative sculpture is taking place around when we arrived at the workshop with the soft sculpture bodies, bras, panties, batting, girdles, and fake gold chains. The girls would giddily construct monstrous bodies with multiple enormous breasts, buttocks overflowing with stuffing from their bikini underwear and conspicuous display of jewelry. These initial experimentations often resulted in the artists realizing that they could create sculptures out of their own bodies, that they would furiously begin to fasten bras and slip layers of panties on over their pants and shorts, stuffing them with batting to create distorted silhouettes. They would erupt in laughter as they helped each other to stuff bras to create cleavage or panties to stimulate huge booties. Cell phones were routinely brought out by the girls to capture their grotesqueries. Through manipulating these socially overdetermined and sexually charged body parts and undergarments with their hands and collaboratively fashioning them with other girls, the project seemed to elicit a feeling of control for them in the construction of their own bodies. So I want to stop there because I know I'm gone over 10 minutes, but that for me is this abolitionist window through the actions of these young girls in collaboration with you and Women on the Rise. So thank you very much for this beautiful.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole. Next, we have remarks from Daphne Taylor-Garcia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And Jill, congratulations on your amazing book. Jill is somebody that I worked with at UCSD. I was very sad to see her go. I learned a lot from her. I mean, Jill, I have learned about, claiming our voices and our space, in academia as we are, and bringing our full complexity, because a lot of coming to these spaces, from working class backgrounds, right, is about discipline and self-erasure, right, to try to maneuver these spaces. And so I've really appreciated learning about that from you. And I also really was super interested by the methodologies you use in this book. And I actually assigned your work for both. I'm actually teaching 2 methodologies classes this quarter. one in undergrad and one grad. And I assigned your work for both because it just gives us such a rich opportunity to talk about the process of how we do research, and the kind of questions that come up and what to consider, interventions you want to make, especially in a field like art history, right? Which is not my area, but, like just even like the way you make areas of art history sound so relevant, and like, oh, this helps me explain something about my own lived experience, even though my other experiences with talking about those fields like Rococo, right? I mean, was not something that I didn't feel like it before your work. I didn't feel like these were terms that I could use for explaining my own, reality, or like, my own aesthetic choices, things like that. So today I was asked to talk about class in this book. And like Darius actually started when he talked was about the use of the terms Black and Latina. So one of the things that I know is very challenging, is talking about Black and Latina experiences, histories, lives in a way that doesn't assume any particular physical appearance, or just makes assumptions about history, that sort of thing. And so I read the differentiation between Black and Latina as one about largely referencing the different histories that people are coming from. And so, leaving it open enough that the people who identify as mixed may be actually of the African diaspora, but may not be visibly racialized as Black, or maybe, but may self-identify as Latina or Hispanic, whatever the term, so many different terms that get used. And so I'm going to use those same terms, Black and Latina, like as Jill uses in her book. And so to talk about class, so there's obviously, a lot of different definitions, working definitions of class, probably one of the more common use definitions is that, people who make a particular amount of money, people who are poor are lower class, people with money are upper class. And so that's probably, one of the more common ways that the term gets used. And of course, another perhaps less well-known example, is that a group of people who share common relations to the means of production, right, are a class, right? And so that latter definition is not about income necessarily, right? And it is about relations to labor and the means of production. But interestingly, so even among people who agree on that latter definition, there is a lot of debate, about who exactly is working class, what are the relationships between different segments of the working class, and, what should be the relationship, between, like, in terms of a politicized relationship between segments of the working class. So with saying all that, I'm going to focus on the way that class is discussed in aesthetics of access, specifically, within Black and Latino communities in Miami, which focuses on more the existential challenges of class, right? In terms of the circulation of resources, right? Living in stigmatized neighborhoods, and the fact that when Black and Latino women, from these neighborhoods appear as anything other than subservient, that they are seen pretty immediately as a problem, right? Something that needs to be controlled, right? A population that needs to be controlled. And so your research focuses largely on, the book focuses largely on young women in their preteen years who are still dependent on their parents. But there's also a chapter, as was mentioned by both Darius and Nicole, a chapter that focuses on teenagers who are single mothers in a residential detention center. And so the main subjects of the book are not those who are already integrated, into the labor market, but those whose inherited circumstances, right, can be described as working class. And so the focus, one of the things that really stood out to me and that I, really appreciated was that by focusing on young women who have not yet become part of the employed population of Miami, it makes it possible to point out what Black and Latina working class women find beautiful or disgusting, displeasing or exciting, sad or joyful, is largely unknown, right? It's largely an unknown because we find ourselves subordinated to an economic system, right, that depends on their assimilation, right, to dominant social norms of gendered and racial respectability, right? And so that's something that really stood out to me, right, is that this, as both, Darius and Nicole, I think, pointed to, right, was that that these are acts of freedom, right? Like it's asserting a sense of self and a sense of being in the world, that is always met with, needs to be silenced, needs to be squashed, needs to be disciplined. And so you use a term in the book, making class burn. And so, yeah, I guess to talk about that, like, what does it mean to say that class burns? And so in this book, first I want to say that, exploring the realm of the symbolic and the sensory in everyday life is crucial for the transformation of institutions of power and for a collective consciousness to fuse, right, to become a collective consciousness. And class can only become a self-conscious collectivity when that explanation resonates, with the full scope of a people's experience, right? So exploring one's aesthetic preferences, expressions, this is all really crucial, for class consciousness. And that's something that I think really, was really a strong impression for me, when reading your book. And, being in a context that consistently tells Black and Latina women how to think and feel, not only about the world, but even about their very selves, right? It's like there's a constant, a refusal to allow Black and Latino women to even think of ourselves as, agents, as conscious beings that have something to say, and contribute to the world. When these women do express themselves, right, it's like met with often comments about being too tacky, too sexual, too masculine, too everything, basically, right? That was something that I was like, everything is too much, right? No matter what. And, but that exploring this, the exploration of aesthetics is crucial in that it will lead to important insights for Black and Latina feminist working class consciousness and collective identity. Right, which is something that I don't think gets talked enough about, is like the relationship between aesthetics and class politics, right? And so it, like that's one, this book just gives you, many pages to contemplate, this relationship. And so, of course, the young women in your book that you focus on, their aesthetic expression is one that speaks directly to the issues of race, class, and gender that they face, right? And that's actually what makes class burn, right? Is because, at least in my reading, right, is that their very expression, right, that speaks to these issues is exactly what is met with, you have to be quiet, you're going to ruin our chances to get funding for the museum, what's so-and-so going to say, right? Like there's always this response of too much, be quiet, assimilate in some way, right? And so it actually made me think about, how the responses to extinguish the aesthetic expression of these young women is actually part of the effort to extinguish any kind of class analysis, in this country, right? No class in that, right? Any sort of class consciousness, any kind of class analysis. And so this is actually a part of that, right? Is like telling these young women to calm down, or to reel themselves in. And so, I think these are issues that are really important, for us to understand, especially those of us who are concerned, about, class issues, you know, and issues of poverty and labor. And another thing that, you know, I was thinking about was how, you know, these young women are likely in a situation that is new in their family's history. You know, whether they move from one of the southern states above Florida or from the Caribbean or from another smaller town within Florida, you know, that the people that are the subjects of this book, you know, and that you are working with, you know, that they are a people in process. So not necessarily a new generation of a consolidated social class, you know, and that one of the things that I think you really illustrate in this book is that becoming a consolidated self-aware group is not a given, but a process, right? And, you know, that the subjects that you're working with are in this context because of larger economic processes, right, that are putting them into the same neighborhoods, right? So there's other things going on, right? That even if historically, you know, they were in different places and have identified in different ways, maybe not in connection with each other, you know, but there's this situation now where, you know, Black and Latina people are in the same neighborhoods now, right? And so needing to rethink, right, identities of the self, the other, you know, who it is that we're talking about when we say we, you know, my community, that sort of thing. Yeah, and so, you know, I think these are all issues that, you know, we should really think more about, you know, for people who think of them as identify as being on the left, you know, or, you know, think specifically about class politics, you know, is all, you know, all of these issues around class consciousness formation and the role of aesthetics. And so one of the things that I also thought about was that, you know, so one of the things that, you know, these young women are not integrated into, you know, they're not employed yet. And if they maintain their sense of aesthetic expression, even after they enter the job market, and actually, Jill, that opening example you gave of giving the talk and people commenting on how you were twirling your hair and things like that, right? It's like, if these young women maintain their sense of aesthetic expression, right? We know that there's going to be assumptions about, you know, not being controllable, being unpredictable, you know, there's going to be predictable, you know, predictable responses, you know, to if they do maintain, you know, their sense of self-expression. So, you know, your book made me think about the fact that we're in a deeper battle to have working class Black and Latina, Black women and Latinas recognized as fully human in the first place, right? A crucial part of which is recognizing their creative expression as such, rather than the current context that relegates it to deviance. And, you know, something that struck me also from reading your book is that what working class women of color wear to go to work is often assumed, I think, in conversations to be the genuine aesthetic of the working class. And something that became really clear to me, or, you know, that something that you know, I think your book helps us think through is that the aesthetic, you know, that the dominant aesthetic, you know, that people will assert as the genuine one of the working class is actually the aesthetic of being subjugated under capitalism, right? It's not one that has been explored or, you know, to its full extent that it can be. Yeah, and so one of the things too, I guess that, I don't know how, you know, the format is, like whether we'll talk more about it, is, you know, one of the themes in your book too is that you point out that, you know, often the righteous outrage that people have against capitalism ends up wrongly manifesting as trying to discipline women, you know, around sexuality, aesthetics, all these sort of things. And, you know, given that aesthetics and economics are not reducible to each other, you know, precisely because the arts are, for example, are largely creative and subjective, whereas the economic is largely about sedimented practice. It made me wonder, like, what would like a workshop, a street project that facilitates, talking about, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, as well as the gendered and aesthetic politics of Marie Antoinette, right, that you talk about at the end of your book, right? And so what does it look like to do both, right? To talk about changing sedimented practices of economics, as well as, the aesthetic and sexual politics that often, or that you talk about, in at the end of your book. So yeah, I think.
Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you so much, Daphne.
Yeah, great. Right, so our next speaker is Juana Maria Rodriguez.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. So this book offers us so many images, insights, ideas about Black and Latinx embodiment. And my comments are gonna focus on some of those interventions and what they offer for the field of sexuality studies and erotics. But first, one of the first contributions that I want to acknowledge that this book documents, theorizes, and manifests is the force of femme friendship. And I think so much of, and really femme friendship as a form of world making, what we really see is how collaboration is so at the heart of what Jillian is documenting in this book. And so the idea that these were kind of femme friendships that evolved into these really enduring bonds. And I loved all the different moments in the book where she's sort of giving these shout outs to her friends. I first met Jillian when she was a graduate student. And my sister, the Nora de Jesus, who appears in the book with holding up a mustache and con una pinga enorme dangling between her legs, right? She's on a plane to Cuba as we speak. So I'm sure that's why she's not here. So it was my sister. It's so lovely to be here with my sort of academic sister, Nicole, who I just love and adore. My forever bottom femme friend, Hoang, who I love it. And Daphne, who's an alum of the program that I am now chairing. So I just love, I love that. I love what that bringing together does. And so, but I also think that it's important in this other way. I think it's precisely through femme friendship that people get together and talk about sex and talk about cellulite and talk about the parts of their bodies that they hate, that they love, what they're doing with their bodies and who they're doing them with. And so there is this way in which femme friendship forms so much of just the foundation for so much that this work does. So this idea of the aesthetics of excess, right? We love the image on the back, is really, it just crystallizes what I think so many of us sort of think and talk about in terms of both the pleasures and the risks of kind of racialized and gendered self-styling. But I actually want to talk a little bit about one of the other key concepts that's forged in this book, which I just think will really prove invaluable to scholars of sexuality, both as a methodology and as a critical insight. And that's her idea of body narratives. And these are the stories of the experiences, desires, and memories of embodiment. And that idea that memories of embodiment, that we have memories of how our bodies used to be, is just, I think, really sort of key in terms of helping us think about how the stories, icons, and lessons that we've inherited about sexuality become the raw materials that we use to shape our own understandings of embodiment, erotics, and sexuality. When part of what asking these girls about, well, what's your ideal body, right? And giving them the kind of critical and creative tools to respond allows us, it demonstrates both how the world has imposed these racialized and gendered norms onto them, but it structures the clapback. It gives them a way to respond, to transform, to really use these things, to understand them as a resource for their own self-fashioning and pleasure. That which has been used to pathologize us becomes, in fact, our greatest strength. But moreover, as a feminist practice of affirming who we are in the bodies we inhabit and how we understand and how we feel about those embodiments struck me as such a powerful pedagogical intervention that we all might benefit from. I have really fond memories of 40. So I remember 40. You could get up and down off your knees really quickly. Anyway, so these are lessons that we get to sort of keep reaffirming over the course of our lifespan. It has been so lovely to see my friend Nicole, who literally has the art world like sucking her toes. Nicole, what can we say? You're just killing it everywhere. So marking time was just such a powerful intervention into what art can mean, what scholarship can mean, and what art does in the world. So I think it's really also important to stress how Jillian's book offers us these really new critical tools for engaging aesthetics and rethinking the disciplinary boundaries of art history, in part by taking seriously the capacity of these young women to theorize the cultural forms that saturate their lives and to authorize them as art critics, authorized to apply these same insights to the realm of high art. I loved all the ways that Jillian did not sanitize these young people's lives. I appreciated the little translations that you provided for some of these little phrases, because, but you also didn't sanitize their belief systems. Even when, we really see, or their lives, we really see how they are continually being disciplined, controlled, exposed to these kind of racist, classist, debilitating structures that they're just so enmeshed in all of the places where they're detained, including their schools, their families, and the youth detention facilities where many of them were confined. By teasing out those moments of conflict or indeed tension, really struck by a really extended, you really hold this conversation about how they were reacting to Zanele Moholi's work. You really hold that conflict a long time. No one gets off easy here. Mm-hmm. It doesn't slide into an easy resolution. And I thought that was so important. Because it really sort of taps into these submerged assumptions and undercurrents that really structure how all of us are engaging aesthetic forms. And I think you really make that visible along the way. And then you just also offer us these just beautiful, dynamic, forceful readings of the very art that you're sharing with these girls. And we really a kind of co-production of meaning making that emerges in that process. This book, like Jillian herself, just has so much bounce. I don't know how else to say it. It's sort of the vibrancy of youth. But I also thought it did such a beautiful job of really theorizing age, which is not a concept that we talk that much about. And how age, along with gender and class and sexuality, really occasions the imaginative conditions of the possible, what we're even able to imagine. I actually very recently turned in my manuscript for Buddha Life. Oh my God, yes.
Cannot wait.
Yes. And most of the women in that book are kind of deep into their 60s, some of them over 70s. And there is always this fear that the aesthetics of excess that so many of us delight in. I, for one, I think I would call my style, you know, I'm aiming for that sort of retired porn star look. I don't know. It's we do what we can.
We're all here for it.
Yes. But so I was really, you know, I live with this idea of like, at what point does that become grotesque? At what point is that too much? At what point are you supposed to tone down the lipstick? So I think those moments of, you know, you have this fabulous idea of the ambivalent grotesque. And that was just really so key for me. You have this one line about how the grotesque body invites confrontations with injustice. And that just, you know, that really worked for me. One of the other things that I love about this book are all of the moments that you really stop to confront your own internalized assumptions about gender and beauty and racialized self-expression. So I really appreciated the way you ended with, like, you know, the moment with the grandmother. Oh no, you know, there's this grandmother, somebody's abuela's in the audience and she's gonna freak out because I'm talking about porn. Instead of, you know, thinking with Lamonda and what kind of porn does the grandma have in her basement?
Right.
So I just really thought that it really occasions such an important intervention that really helps us all think about our own normative frameworks for thinking who is and is not a subject of sexuality and pleasure. So thank you for bringing me so much pleasure in this text.
Thank you so much, Juana. Thank you, Juana. Thank you, Nicole, Daphne, Darius. I am so moved. And I'll just quickly respond so that if there's any conversation, but for me, it's been such a gift to have your engagement and your presence, and you know, Juana, you know, reorienting me to appreciate the ways in which femme friendship and collaboration shows up, and really thinking about age, which, like, I didn't really think my book was doing that. And it's just so amazing to have engagements that show you all this work. Nicole, I really appreciate also, like, the call to really think about how abolition, you know, works in the project, because I really hadn't thought of it explicitly. And so that also just sort of broadens the ways I can think of the potential political work that the book might be able to do. And as far as, like, feminist art history intervention, I mean, you are blazing trails that are so important, and I am just so lucky to be in this moment where I can follow you, Nicole, in the realm of art history, because I know that we've both shared similar experiences of navigating that terrain, especially within a sort of context of feminist art history and what that looks like. So if you read this as an intervention into art history, like, I'm good. I'm done. I've done my work. So thank you so much for that. And to Daphne, also, although, of course, you know, I really wanted to do work about class. I think so many times class is like the tail end of a sentence about feminist scholarship that never actually gets picked up. You know, people say they do it, but like, real attention, I don't think, is often placed on it. And I was looking at class, but I really love how you're also asking about how we can actually think about class consciousness sort of emerging within these relations through aesthetics, and how, you know, how the positioning of the girls sort of shapes what becomes sort of legible or read as class. So I just want to thank you so much for for that sort of, orientation to think about collective consciousness that I was sort of gesturing towards, but I don't think really paid as much of attention to as I could. So I'm really, really glad for that engagement and orientation. And to Darius, I love the emphasis on the haptic, and I'm so glad that resonated in this idea of the coalitional sort of possibilities of, I like that you named both like how Blackness and the artifice of whiteness were both sort of formations that need to be avoided, like even as whiteness is the aspiration, that there's a particular formation or figuration of whiteness that also needs to be disavowed in order to be legible, right, as respectable, because you also can't appear to be a girl or woman of color who wants to be white too much or too obviously, right? And so I'm just so moved by your comments and your analysis, and that attention to the haptic and that attention to the coalitional, which is ultimately, I think, what I hope comes out of the text is the potential of collaboration and the coalitional with all of the messiness that involves, because in the book it certainly is not clean, it's not happy, and I'm just happy for the brilliant collective that is present here today. So with that, I'll end, but I cannot thank you all enough.
Thank you so much. I would like to give the opportunity for the panelists to respond or comment on each other's remarks.
I would like to just say that I loved all the presentations and I love this book so much, but Daphne, thank you for your comments on class. And I think it's so interesting, Jillian, that you said maybe you're not as aware as much as the book is doing this work, but I felt like your presence in the book was this deep exploration of class and your own self-consciousness around your class presentation. In fact, the moment when you're called a Bratz doll, I was like, oh my God, that's like the highest form of like, somebody call me a Bratz doll,
Right.
And you're kind of struggle with that, so I think that you're doing class, which is a kind of Marxist 70s way of framing it, but you're doing class throughout the book. And I think that is such a great kind of pedagogical kind of model for students to understand class as something that's not abstract or not, that's just like about antagonisms, not just about top down, but like you're doing it.
Yeah.
Through anxiety. I mean, I think we do, we perform class through our class anxieties, through all the ways in which we don't fit in, through all the ways we worry about whether we're doing it, whatever it is, right. And so, you give us that.
And what we aspire to, because Juana wants to be a retired porn star. I want to be a Bratz doll. I
love it. I do. And it's because we don't have the language. I mean, I think that the anxiety is the language for class because we can't name it, like Daphne pointed out too, it's just not, we don't have those terms. So it gets played out through all these other politics and relations.
The other thing that I want to say is, so, Ken knows this, I was a reader for the book. And when I got the manuscript, I was like, this is brilliant and what a mess. And I had no idea what you were going to do with, you had these little images and you had these and then when I read it as a book, I was like, these are all the same parts, but they're just beautiful and woven and tight and just, they are that outfit that has too much, but is working every last inch of glitter. So I loved how you got the press to it's just gorgeous. It's so you did that for all of us. And so I went ahead and like doubled the number of images, Ken, that I'm sending in Buddha Life. So there you go.
Well, thank you, Juana. And I'm
Gorgeous.
following Marie Miller Young in that too, because the bar was set with you know, with a taste for brown sugar too. I mean, I'm just following that act, you know, but thank you so much. Hey, Marie! I said that, I had told that to Marie recently. She's like, I know. She's like, I know you did. So I'm just so happy to be in this company. But I think for me, and I do hope if folks engage the book that you read the epilogue, the demise of Women on the Rise was just so beyond heartbreaking and so enmeshed in the politics of class and gentrification that for me, including all of these images, including of Dinora with her huge hanging phallus, were so important, you know, as a testament, but also as a tremendous like fuck you to the art world for the ways in which this program was appropriated and erased. So I think like that there's a politics, right, in that performance of excess. Like you might have erased this work or suspended this work, but we're here.
Thank you. I wonder, Darius, I think you unmuted yourself. Do you have a comment you wanted to share?
No, my comment was just about the body of the text itself as well. I mean, I could have written an entire sort of response to that. It's really, really beautiful. And, you know, like, you know, what can I do that's creative in this next text? But yeah, that's what I want to say.
Great.
Yeah, and what may have been messiness at one time comes across as like really rigorous complexity.
Yes.
And it just like what the conversation we were having around class earlier, and also the presentation of the book, which is the presentation of the aesthetic of excess. It really it engages with Deb Vargas, also like the work she's doing around Sucio and queer, you know, and what Juana said about like, you did not sanitize these girls. Thank you for not doing that. You know, because I think often when quote advocacy comes, especially around girls being punished, right? There's a type of sanitization that does nothing for the lived experience of gender and sexuality.
Yeah.
And when they were like grappling with those with the, you know, the sculptural moment was for me, like that is an abolition moment, because for those of us who do not like engage prisons and prison studies, it is like where it is this kind of sedimentation of gender assignment and sexual regulations, right? And so like any type of, you know, this moment of collaborative, like it's an orgy that's taking place. You know, it's like orgiastic.
It is. It really is. And, you know, Lavonda, you know, there too, for sure, in thinking of that space. And I actually use Lavonda Horton-Stallings' framework of like wild safety that can be cultivated between, you know, within these communities. And for me, the masculinity chapter, I hope gets taken up because I find like that's one of my favorite. I just love the narratives there. Like the body narratives there are just so rich. And I do think that the book is overwhelmingly trafficking in femme aesthetics of excess, but to me, that chapter just holds like a special place, because there I think the sexual and the erotic aspects that I'm talking about, thinking about like the aesthetics of excess of masculinity as like indexing money that can get you, you know, a lover, right? And how that works. Was just something that you know, was just a pleasure for me to write and think about.
So unfortunately, we are out of time. I just want to say this has been you know, I've been looking forward to. We planned this Zoom and Hearts, I think, since the fall. You know, I think I was drunk when I was Facebooking Jillian. So it was just, you know, I'm so glad it worked out. It worked out really, really well. So, right, this is, you know, during COVID, what else do I have to do, right? Right.
I really appreciate it. It's so much work, and this is just brilliant.
It was a pleasure, and I'm so happy and grateful to all the scholars for making time. I know it's a very busy time of the, you know, in the semester and the quarter, and yeah, I'm just really, you know, happy, delighted, and thrilled. I'm just the only thing you can't see my my copy, but I'm just sad that I can't have you signed it, in person. But we'll figure something out in the
We will.
But thank you also to everyone. We were up to 190 participants, so there was,
That's
it's
awesome.
yeah. So it's many people are excited about the text. There were some questions about where to buy the book. It is from Duke University Press. You can get it on Bookshop. Yeah, so please support independent vendors if you're able to. And
Ken,
please.
Ken, is there a discount? Sorry, Hung. I was
Oh, okay,
asking
yeah, no,
Ken of Duke.
Ken.
Is there a Duke UP discount that people can order? Use?
Is Ken still there?
Yes, Ken is there.
Okay. There should be, yes. Right, he says. Okay. All right. I can follow up with, because I have folks who registered. I have the email, so I'll send out the discount code, okay, shortly.
Oh,
let's
here,
see.
I think I have one.
Yeah. Okay. So can you paste it in the
Yeah,
chat?
hang on.
You
let's
have it.
see.
Oh yeah, and also another plug. Those of you who are educators out there, please invite Jillian to Zoom in or to come in person to your classes and workshops and other spaces. As you can see, she's a wonderful speaker. And yeah, so I'm sure there are other juicy tidbits that she can share, right? All the gossip.
Thank you so much, Hoang.
Right.
And I'm down to hang out and chat with folks if
Right.
you